The wedding reception hall fell into an uncomfortable silence as Henry approached the grand piano in the corner. Guests turned in their chairs, champagne glasses pausing halfway to their lips, as the man in the ill-fitting borrowed suit sat down at the bench. The bride's stepfather had just finished his toast, speaking about wealth and status and proper matches, when Henry had quietly stood up and asked if he could play something. The room buzzed with whispered confusion. Who was this janitor? What was he doing at their elegant celebration? The bride, Sarah, watched with curious eyes as her mother, Elizabeth, suddenly went pale, her hand trembling as she set down her wineglass. When Henry's weathered fingers touched the ivory keys, even the most skeptical guests leaned forward. But no one in that opulent ballroom could have imagined the story behind the melody that was about to fill the air, or how it would change everything they thought they knew about love, loss, and the man they had dismissed as just another working-class outsider. To understand how this moment came to be, we need to go back 25 years to when Henry was a different man entirely. Back then, he wore pressed shirts instead of work uniforms, played concert halls instead of cleaning them, and had dreams that stretched far beyond the confines of his current life. He had been a music teacher at the local high school, passionate about sharing the beauty of classical composition with teenagers who would rather listen to anything else. But there was one student who always stayed after class, a girl named Elizabeth, whose fingers danced across the piano keys like they were born to make music. Elizabeth wasn't just talented, she was extraordinary. Henry recognized something in her playing that went beyond technique or practice. She had the rare gift of translating pure emotion through sound, of making listeners feel things they didn't even know they carried inside them. During those long afternoon sessions in the empty music room, with dust motes floating in the golden sunlight, Henry began to fall in love, not just with Elizabeth's music, but with Elizabeth herself. She was 18, a senior about to graduate and head off to the conservatory. He was 28, her teacher, and smart enough to know that what he felt was impossible. But Elizabeth felt it too, in those stolen moments between lessons when their hands would accidentally touch while reaching for sheet music, when their eyes would meet across the piano bench, when she would play something so beautiful that it made him forget every rule he had ever learned about appropriate boundaries. The night of her graduation, she came to him with tears in her eyes and told him she loved him. Not as a student loves a teacher, but as a woman loves a man. Henry knew he should have sent her away, should have protected both their futures by maintaining the distance that society demanded. Instead, he kissed her in that empty music room, surrounded by the instruments that had brought them together. They tried to make it work. Elizabeth deferred her conservatory admission for a year, and Henry resigned from his teaching position to avoid the scandal that would have destroyed both their reputations. He took a job as a night janitor at the same school where he had once taught, cleaning the very classrooms where he had once inspired young minds. Elizabeth worked at a local music store during the day, giving private lessons to children whose parents could afford what she offered. In the evenings, they would meet at Henry's small apartment, where he had managed to squeeze in an old upright piano, and they would create music together like they were the only two people in the world. It was during those precious months that Henry wrote the song. Elizabeth would hum melodies while she cooked dinner, unconscious fragments of beauty that seemed to pour out of her like breathing. Henry would sit at the piano, capturing these moments, weaving them into something larger and more complete. The composition grew slowly, organically, like a garden tended with infinite patience. It wasn't grand or dramatic. It was intimate, personal, full of the small joys and quiet hopes that filled their hidden life together. He called it Elizabeth's song, though he never told her that. It was his secret gift to her, his way of preserving the happiness he somehow knew couldn't last forever. because it couldn't last. Elizabeth's parents discovered the relationship and were horrified. Their daughter, who had been accepted to one of the most prestigious music programs in the country, was throwing away her future for a janitor 10 years older than herself. They threatened to cut off all financial support, to disown her completely if she continued this foolishness. Elizabeth's mother, Margaret, came to Henry's apartment one cold November evening and begged him to let her daughter go. She didn't speak with cruelty or contempt, just with the desperate love of a mother who saw her child's dreams slipping away. Henry looked at Elizabeth that night, saw the conflict tearing her apart, and made the hardest decision of his life. He told her she had to choose between her music and him, knowing exactly what choice she would make, because that was who Elizabeth was. Someone who loved music more than safety, more than comfort, more than even him. She left 3 days later, tears streaming down her face as Henry stood in his doorway and watched her taxi disappear around the corner. He never played Elizabeth's song again after that night. The melody felt too heavy, too full of what might have been. The years that followed were not kind to Henry. He continued working as a janitor, moving from school to school, never staying long enough to form connections that might remind him of what he had lost. He stopped composing, stopped playing, except for the occasional moment when muscle memory would betray him and his fingers would find familiar patterns on whatever piano he happened to encounter. He heard through mutual acquaintances that Elizabeth had graduated at the top of her class, that she was performing with symphony orchestras across the country, that she had become everything he had always known she could be. The knowledge brought him both joy and a pain so sharp it sometimes took his breath away. At 35, Henry met Claire at a diner where he ate breakfast most mornings before his shift. She was a nurse, recently divorced, with kind eyes and a laugh that reminded him it was possible to feel something other than regret. Claire didn't know about his past as a teacher or his talent for composition. To her, he was simply a good man who worked hard and treated her with a gentleness she had never experienced before. They married 2 years later in a simple ceremony at City Hall. And when their son David was born, Henry thought he had finally found a way to move forward from the ghosts that had haunted him for so long. David inherited his father's musical gifts, though Henry was careful not to push too hard. He would catch the boy humming complex melodies that seemed to come from nowhere, would find him picking out tunes on the old upright piano Henry had bought for their small house. When David asked for piano lessons at age 7, Henry began teaching him, carefully, secretly, sharing the knowledge that had once filled his professional life. These became some of Henry's happiest moments, watching his son discover the magic that lived inside music, seeing David's face light up when he mastered a particularly challenging passage. But happiness, Henry had learned, was often temporary. Claire was diagnosed with cancer when David was 12. The disease moved quickly, aggressively, giving them only months instead of the decades they had planned. Henry spent every moment he could at her bedside, holding her hand while she slept, reading to her when she was awake, playing soft melodies on a keyboard he brought to her hospital room. The night before she died, Claire squeezed his hand and told him she knew about Elizabeth. Not the details, but the fact that he had loved someone before her with a depth that had shaped the man she fell in love with. She made him promise to keep music alive for David, to not let his own pain rob their son of the gift they both carried. After Claire's funeral, Henry threw himself into his work and David's care with desperate intensity. The boy was grieving too, processing the loss of his mother in ways that alternated between heartbreaking maturity and the raw emotion of a child who couldn't understand why good people had to die. Music became their shared language during those dark months. When David cried, Henry would play lullabies. When anger made the boy want to break things, Henry would teach him to pound out dramatic pieces that gave his fury a voice. When sadness felt too heavy to carry, they would sit together at the piano and create gentle melodies that acknowledged the pain without being consumed by it. The years passed, and David grew into a talented young musician who spoke often of following in his father's footsteps as a music teacher. Henry encouraged this dream while battling his own complicated feelings about returning to the profession that had once meant everything to him. David applied to colleges, auditioned for music programs, and was accepted to several schools with scholarship offers that made Henry's heart swell with pride. But the night before David was supposed to leave for his freshman year at the state university, he came to his father with tears in his eyes and said he couldn't go. The tuition, even with scholarships, was beyond what Henry could afford on a janitor's salary. They had both known this might happen, but hope had carried them forward until reality finally demanded acknowledgement. David got a job at a local restaurant and enrolled in community college, insisting that he was happy with this plan, that he didn't need a prestigious degree to become a good teacher. But Henry saw the disappointment his son tried to hide, saw the dreams being quietly folded away in favor of practical compromise. It was during this period that Henry began working extra shifts, taking on weekend cleaning jobs at office buildings, saving every penny he could toward David's eventual transfer to a 4-year school. The work was exhausting, but it gave him purpose beyond his own grief and regret. One evening, while cleaning the offices of a law firm downtown, Henry overheard a conversation that stopped him in his tracks. 2 attorneys were discussing an upcoming wedding. One of their colleagues' daughters was marrying into a wealthy family, and it was going to be quite the social event. The bride's name was Sarah Mitchell, and her mother was the accomplished pianist Elizabeth Mitchell, who had recently moved back to town after her husband's death. Henry's hands trembled as he continued wiping down the conference table, processing the information that Elizabeth was not only back in their shared hometown, but had lost her husband just as he had lost Claire. For weeks after this discovery, Henry debated whether to reach out to Elizabeth. What would he say? What right did he have to intrude on her grief with his own complicated feelings? But when he learned through the same office gossip that Elizabeth was struggling to plan her daughter's wedding while managing her late husband's estate, Henry found himself walking to the address he had looked up in the phone book. He stood outside her house for nearly an hour, gathering courage he wasn't sure he possessed. When Elizabeth opened the door, 25 years collapsed into nothing. She looked older, of course, with silver threading through her dark hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of both laughter and sorrow. But she was still unmistakably the girl who had stayed after music class, who had hummed melodies that became the soundtrack to the happiest months of his life. They stared at each other in silence for a long moment before Elizabeth stepped back and invited him in. The conversation that followed was careful, tentative, full of the weight of everything they had never said to each other. Elizabeth told him about her career, the symphony performances, the recordings, the awards that had decorated a life dedicated to music. But she also told him about the loneliness that had accompanied success, about the husband who had loved her but never really understood the passion that drove her artistry, about the daughter who was talented but chose security over the uncertain path of professional musicianship. Henry shared his own story, Claire's illness and death, David's dreams and the financial realities that threatened them, the years of carrying music inside himself without anyone to share it with. As Elizabeth made tea in her kitchen, Henry noticed the piano in her living room. It was a beautiful instrument, a baby grand that seemed to fill the space with potential even in silence. When he commented on it, Elizabeth smiled sadly and said she rarely played anymore. The music felt too big for her empty house, too full of memories that no one else was there to share. On impulse, Henry asked if he could play something for her. Elizabeth nodded, and Henry found himself sitting at her piano, his fingers rediscovering the keys like greeting an old friend. The melody that emerged was Elizabeth's song, the composition he had written so many years ago and never played for its inspiration. The music filled the room with all the love and loss and hope that Henry had carried since their first goodbye. Elizabeth listened with tears streaming down her face, recognizing fragments of her own unconscious humming woven into something larger and more beautiful than she had ever imagined. When Henry finished, she walked over to the piano bench and sat beside him, just as she had during those golden afternoons in the high school music room. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and if music has ever connected you to someone in an unexpected way. Over the following months, Henry and Elizabeth began to rebuild a friendship that honored both their shared past and their individual journeys. Henry learned that Elizabeth's late husband had been a good man, a doctor who provided stability and support for her career, but who viewed music as her profession rather than her passion. Elizabeth learned about Claire with gratitude rather than jealousy, understanding that Henry's love for his wife had been different from what they had shared, but equally real and important. They talked about their children, about the dreams they carried for the next generation, about the ways that love changes shape without diminishing in intensity. When Elizabeth mentioned her anxiety about the wedding planning, Henry offered to help in whatever way he could. He had no experience with high society events, but he understood the importance of music in marking life's significant moments. Elizabeth was handling most of the arrangements herself, determined to give Sarah the celebration she deserved despite the financial strain of managing the estate and the emotional challenge of organizing a wedding without her husband's support. Henry found himself volunteering for small tasks, picking up flowers, coordinating with vendors, anything that might ease Elizabeth's burden. As the wedding date approached, Elizabeth confided her deepest worry to Henry. Sarah had asked her to perform at the reception, to play something meaningful that would honor both her late father and her future with her fiancé. Elizabeth wanted to say yes, wanted to give her daughter this gift, but she wasn't sure she could manage the emotional intensity of performing at such a personal event. She hadn't played publicly in months, not since her husband's funeral, and the thought of sitting at a piano in front of all those people made her feel vulnerable in a way that professional performances never had. Henry listened to Elizabeth's concerns and found himself making an offer that surprised them both. He would attend the wedding as her guest, and if she needed support, if the performance became too overwhelming, he would be there to help. Elizabeth looked at him with wonder and gratitude, remembering why she had fallen in love with his kindness so many years ago. But there was something she didn't tell him, something she wasn't sure she could say out loud. She had been thinking about Elizabeth's song, about the beauty Henry had created from their shared memories, and she wondered if perhaps that music belonged at her daughter's wedding more than anything else she might choose to perform. The day of the wedding arrived with all the chaos and emotion that such events invariably bring. Henry dressed in his best suit, which he had borrowed from David since his own formal wear was decades out of date. He felt out of place among the wealthy guests with their designer clothes and easy confidence, but Elizabeth's presence beside him made the discomfort bearable. Sarah looked radiant in her wedding gown, and Henry could see echoes of young Elizabeth in her daughter's face, the same intelligence and sensitivity that had first captured his attention all those years ago. The ceremony itself was beautiful, held in an elegant church with flowers cascading from every available surface. Henry watched Elizabeth during the service, saw her wipe away tears as Sarah exchanged vows with her fiancé, saw her struggle with the bittersweet joy of watching her daughter begin a new chapter without her father there to witness it. When the bride and groom kissed to seal their marriage, Henry felt a deep gratitude for being allowed to share in this moment, for the unexpected gift of witnessing Elizabeth's happiness even in the midst of her loss. The reception was held at an exclusive country club, with crystal chandeliers and tables decorated with roses that probably cost more than Henry made in a week. The guests were exactly what he had expected: well-dressed, well-connected people who moved through the world with the confidence that comes from never having to worry about money or social status. Henry felt their curious glances, heard their whispered questions about who the working-class man at Elizabeth's table might be. But Elizabeth stayed close to him, including him in conversations, introducing him to old friends as someone important from her past without offering details that might invite judgment. The dinner was elaborate, course after course of carefully prepared food that Henry ate carefully, mindful of unfamiliar etiquette and the way others watched his every move. The speeches began after dessert, with Sarah's stepfather offering a toast that emphasized the financial stability and social connections that the marriage represented. He spoke about proper matches and advantageous unions, about the importance of marrying within one's class and social circle. The words felt like subtle daggers aimed at anyone who might not meet his standards of acceptability, and Henry saw Elizabeth tense beside him as the implications became clear. Other family members and friends took turns offering their congratulations, each speech reinforcing the theme of wealth and status and the bright future that awaited the young couple. Henry listened politely, but he couldn't help noticing what was missing from all these carefully crafted words. No one spoke about love as a force that transcends material considerations. No one mentioned the courage it takes to choose a partner based on connection rather than convenience. No one acknowledged that the strongest marriages are built on understanding and shared dreams rather than shared bank accounts. When the formal speeches concluded, Elizabeth stood to address the gathering. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke about her late husband, about the pride he would have felt seeing their daughter so happy. She talked about the importance of family, about the bonds that sustain us through both joy and sorrow. And then she mentioned that she had planned to perform something special for the bride and groom, a musical gift to mark this important day. But as she moved toward the piano, Henry could see her anxiety building, could recognize the signs of someone struggling with an emotional task that felt too overwhelming to manage alone. That was when Henry made his decision. He stood up from his table, ignoring the surprised glances and whispered comments from the other guests, and walked over to where Elizabeth stood frozen beside the grand piano. He spoke quietly to her, asking if she would like him to play instead, if perhaps Elizabeth's song might be the perfect choice for this moment. Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears as she nodded, understanding that he was offering to share not just the performance, but the vulnerability that came with revealing something so personal to a room full of strangers. And that brought us back to the moment when Henry sat down at the piano, when the elegant reception hall fell silent with confusion and skepticism. The guests saw only a janitor in an ill-fitting suit, someone who clearly didn't belong in their sophisticated gathering. They waited for him to embarrass himself, to confirm their assumptions about class and capability and who deserves to be heard. But when Henry's fingers found the keys, when the first notes of Elizabeth's song began to fill the air, everything changed. The melody was exquisite, complex enough to showcase real talent, but intimate enough to feel like a personal gift. It spoke of young love and impossible choices, of dreams deferred in paths not taken, of finding beauty in unexpected places and holding on to hope when circumstances seem insurmountable. Henry played with the skill of someone who had been trained professionally, but also with the emotion of someone who had lived every note, who had carried this music inside him for 25 years without anyone to share it with. As the song continued, Henry began to notice changes in his audience. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Champagne glasses were set down without thought. The bride's stepfather, who had spoken so eloquently about proper matches and social status, found himself leaning forward with genuine attention. Sarah stood transfixed, recognizing something profound in the music, even if she couldn't identify its source. And Elizabeth, standing beside the piano with tears streaming down her face, began to hum along with the melody she had inspired so long ago. The final notes faded into silence that felt different from the skeptical quiet that had greeted Henry's approach to the piano. This was the silence of people processing something unexpected and beautiful, of assumptions being quietly reconsidered. Sarah was the first to speak, approaching the piano with wonder in her eyes. She asked Henry who had written the song, where she had heard it before, why it felt so familiar and meaningful. Henry looked at Elizabeth, giving her the choice of how much to reveal, how much of their story belonged to this moment. Elizabeth stepped forward and placed her hand on Henry's shoulder, a gesture that spoke volumes to anyone paying attention. She told the gathering that the song had been written by someone very important to her, someone who understood music as a language of the heart rather than a display of technical skill. She didn't share the full story. That would have been inappropriate for a wedding celebration. But she said enough to make it clear that Henry was not just a random guest, but someone who had played a significant role in her musical development and personal growth. The bride's stepfather, who had seemed so dismissive of anyone outside his social circle, approached Henry with genuine curiosity. He asked about Henry's musical training, his background, his connection to the family. When Henry explained his years as a music teacher, his current work as a janitor, and his friendship with Elizabeth, the man's expression shifted from condescension to something approaching respect. He had never considered that someone who cleaned buildings might also create beauty, that economic circumstances didn't necessarily reflect artistic capability or personal worth. Other guests began to approach the piano, asking Henry to play other pieces, sharing their own stories about music and memory and the songs that had shaped their lives. Henry found himself at the center of conversations that went deeper than the surface-level small talk that had dominated the earlier part of the evening. People spoke about their abandoned dreams, about the instruments they used to play, about the ways that music had comforted them through difficult times. The performance had opened something in the room, had created space for authenticity in a setting that had previously valued only appearances. Sarah asked Henry to play Elizabeth's song again, and this time Elizabeth joined him at the piano bench. Together, they performed the melody as a duet. Elizabeth adding harmonies and variations that transformed the piece into something even more beautiful than its original form. Watching them play together, seeing the connection that transcended time and circumstance, the wedding guests began to understand that they were witnessing something rare and precious. This wasn't just musical entertainment. It was a glimpse into the kind of love that survives separation and loss and the passage of years. Share if you've ever experienced something similar, where someone from your past returned to your life in an unexpected way. As the evening continued, Henry found himself thinking about David, about the dreams his son had set aside in favor of financial practicality. The scholarship opportunities that had seemed so limited now felt more possible, not because the financial realities had changed, but because Henry had been reminded of the power of taking risks, of believing that talent and passion matter more than economic status. Elizabeth, as if reading his thoughts, approached him during a quiet moment and asked about his son's musical ambitions. Henry shared David's story with Elizabeth, explained the financial challenges that had forced his son to postpone his university plans. Elizabeth listened with the intensity she had once brought to learning complex compositions, and Henry could see her forming ideas even as he spoke. She asked if David would be interested in auditioning for some programs she was familiar with, mentioned scholarships and opportunities that Henry had never heard of, connections she might be able to facilitate. It wasn't charity, she insisted, but recognition of talent that deserved support and development. The conversation was interrupted by Sarah, who approached with her new husband to thank Henry for the musical gift he had given their wedding. She told him that Elizabeth's song would always be associated with this day in her memory, that she had never heard anything more beautiful or meaningful. Her husband, who had initially seemed skeptical of the man his mother-in-law had brought as her guest, extended his hand and expressed genuine gratitude for Henry's contribution to their celebration. The gesture felt significant, a bridge across the social and economic divisions that had seemed so insurmountable earlier in the evening. As the reception began to wind down, Elizabeth and Henry found themselves alone at the piano again. The other guests were saying their goodbyes, collecting coats and purses, making plans for future gatherings. But Henry and Elizabeth sat in comfortable silence, both processing the unexpected turn their evening had taken. Elizabeth spoke first, thanking Henry not just for the performance, but for reminding her why music mattered, why the connections it created were worth preserving and celebrating. Henry looked at the woman who had shaped his understanding of love and artistry, who had unknowingly inspired the most beautiful piece of music he had ever created, who had walked back into his life when he needed hope more than he had realized. He thought about the paths they had taken apart from each other, about the good people they had loved and lost, about the children who carried their dreams forward into an uncertain future. And he realized that some stories don't end with dramatic reunions or storybook endings, but with the quieter recognition that love takes many forms and that the most important connections transcend time and circumstance. The ride home was peaceful, filled with comfortable conversation about the evening's events and tentative plans for David's educational future. Elizabeth had invited Henry and his son to dinner the following weekend, ostensibly to discuss scholarship opportunities, but really to continue the connection that had been renewed in such an unexpected way. Henry felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in years. Not because his circumstances had dramatically changed, but because he had been reminded that his story wasn't over, that there were still chapters to be written and music to be shared. When he arrived at his small house, David was waiting up, eager to hear about the wedding and curious about his father's unusually formal attire. Henry sat down at their old upright piano and played Elizabeth's song for his son, sharing for the first time the story of its creation and the woman who had inspired it. David listened with growing amazement, recognizing the technical skill in the composition, but also understanding the emotional journey it represented. When Henry finished playing, David asked if he could learn the piece, if perhaps it might be something he could perform at his own auditions for music programs. The request filled Henry with a joy so profound it brought tears to his eyes. Music had always been the language through which he expressed love, first for Elizabeth, then for Claire, always for David. The idea that his son wanted to carry forward the melody that had sustained Henry through decades of separation and loss felt like the most perfect ending he could have imagined. But as he began teaching David the opening measures, Henry realized this wasn't an ending at all. It was a continuation, a passing forward of beauty and hope and the understanding that love transcends every barrier that society tries to erect. Over the following months, David's musical education took on new dimensions thanks to Elizabeth's connections and guidance. But more importantly, Henry rediscovered his own relationship with music, began composing again, started teaching private lessons to supplement his income from janitorial work. Elizabeth and Henry developed a friendship that honored their past while embracing their present circumstances. Two people who had learned that love comes in many forms and that the most lasting connections are built on shared understanding rather than shared circumstances. Would you have done the same in his place, choosing to support someone's dreams even if it meant revealing your own vulnerabilities? The wedding had taught everyone present that appearances can be deceiving, that talent and worth aren't determined by economic status or social position. Sarah and her husband began their marriage with a deeper appreciation for the complexity of human experience, for the stories that lie beneath surface judgments. Elizabeth found her way back to public performance, but with a new understanding of music as a bridge between people rather than a showcase of individual achievement. And Henry discovered that the music he had carried silently for so many years was meant to be shared, that isolation had been a choice rather than an inevitable consequence of his circumstances. But perhaps the most important lesson wasn't about music at all, but about the courage it takes to show up authentically in a world that often values appearances over truth. Henry's decision to approach the piano that evening, to offer his gift in a room full of skeptical strangers, had required a bravery that went beyond technical skill or artistic confidence. It was the bravery of someone who believes that beauty matters more than belonging, that connection is possible even across seemingly insurmountable social divisions, that love in all its forms deserves to be celebrated rather than hidden. As Henry tucked away his borrowed suit and returned to his regular routine of work and parenting and the thousand small tasks that make up an ordinary life, he carried with him the memory of that moment when his music had transformed a room full of strangers into a community of listeners. The janitor had reminded the wedding guests that everyone has a story worth hearing, that talent and wisdom can emerge from the most unexpected places, that the human heart recognizes authenticity regardless of the package in which it arrives. The song he had written for Elizabeth so many years ago had found its way to exactly where it belonged. Not hidden away in regret and what-if thinking, but shared openly as a gift that honored both past love and present possibility. And in that sharing, Henry had discovered something he had forgotten during his years of quiet service and hidden dreams. Music, like love, grows stronger when it's given away freely, when it's offered without expectation of return, when it's trusted to find the hearts that need to hear it most. True worth isn't measured by wealth or status, but by the courage to share your gifts with the world, even when that world might not immediately recognize their value. Family isn't just about blood relations, but about the people who choose to stay and support each other through both celebration and sorrow. And sometimes the most powerful moments happen when we stop hiding who we really are and trust that our authentic selves are enough. Subscribe for more powerful stories like this and click on the video on the screen to watch the next one with a twist so powerful you'll never forget it.